Cut the working hours. Increase the number of jobs. Increase the amount of the salary. Transform production and place it under workers' control. Liberation of the huge amount of intelligence that is wasted by capitalism. Technology has been used so far as a means of control and exploitation. It wants to be turned into a tool for liberation. Working less is possible thanks to the application of cybernetics and informatics. Zero work for income. Automate all production. All power to living labor. All work to dead labor. Of course, we now know that the revolution did not happen. But the material conditions for such a revolution are more in place in the 21st century than they were in 1977. What has shifted beyond all recognition since then is the existential and emotional atmosphere. Populations are resigned to the sadness of work, even as they are told that automation is making their jobs disappear. We must regain the optimism of that 70s moment, just as we must carefully analyze all the machineries that capital deployed to convert confidence into dejection. Understanding how this process of consciousness deflation worked is the first step to reversing it.
What is the bad news we already know is that the dimension of the future has disappeared. That in some ways that we're marooned, we're trapped in the 20th century still. That what is it to be in the 21st century is to have 20th century culture on higher definition screens, or 20th century culture distributed by high-speed internet. Actually, so there's a strange, what ought to be a strange sense of repetition, of a clotted or blocked time, a time that's in many respects slowed down or flattened or retarded or gone backwards. You can look back to the Guy Debord period, Guy Debord's 60s, the spectacle. Again, it seems like some genteel period. You had to put TV on and see an advertising billboard in order to be commanded or have your nervous system assailed by the urgencies of capitalism. Now we carry them around at all times with us. And it's important to remember, in Deleuze describes communication. Communication is a command. This is when we open up, we look at our smartphones, we're essentially being commanded. And this is a weight on our nervous system that wasn't previously there. We're facing these hundreds of commands every day. Which we may well ignore them. Obviously, we have to ignore them. We can't possibly follow them. Nevertheless, the strain on our nervous system must be telling at some level.
It may be a temporary setback. I would not say, as practically everyone says, let's apply it to this country, that the student movement was defeated, that it doesn't exist anymore. It has changed its form, it still exists. And what is to me the most important thing, some of the values proclaimed by the student movement have actually penetrated the society as a whole and are diffused among the population as a whole. For example, let me give you one example, otherwise it's too abstract. The almost general awareness that one does not have to work 8 hours a day plus the hours required for transportation in an inhuman and routine and mechanized way, that one can live much easier without giving up most of the achievements of culture and so on. This is one of the achievements of the student movement, and this can be demonstrated, by the way.
All its carnivalesque departures from everyday reality, however, this is no remote utopia. It feels like an actual social space, one you can imagine really existing. You are as likely to come upon a crank or a huckster as a poet or musician here, and who knows if today's crank might turn out to be tomorrow's genius. It is also an egalitarian and democratic space, and a certain affect presides over everything. There is multiplicity, but little sign of resentment or malice. It is a space for fellowship, for meeting, and talking as much for having your mind blown. The crucial defining feature of the psychedelic is the question of consciousness and its relationship to what is experienced as reality. If the very fundamentals of our experience, such as our sense of space and time, can be altered, does that not mean that the categories by which we live are plastic, mutable? Yet the claim that altered states of consciousness took you 1,000,000 miles away from reality was question-begging. It foreclosed the idea that altered state of consciousness could offer a perception of the systems of power, exploitation, and ritual that was more, not less, lucid than ordinary consciousness. In the 60s, when consciousness was increasingly besieged by the fantasies and images of advertising and capitalist spectacle, how solid was the reality from which psychedelic states fled in any case? Wasn't the state of consciousness susceptible to spectacle more like somnambulance than alertness or awareness? In retrospect, one of the most remarkable features of the psychedelic culture of the 1960s was the way it mainstreamed such metaphysical questions. Experiments with consciousness were now in principle open to anyone. Despite all the mysticism and pseudo-spiritualism which has always hung over psychedelic culture, there was actually a demystificatory and materialist dimension to this. Widespread experiments with consciousness promised nothing less than a democratization of neurology itself, a newly widespread awareness of the brain's role in producing what was experienced as reality. Those on acid trips were externally seeing the workings of their own brain, and potentially learning to use their brains differently. Yet psychedelic experiences were not confined to those who had taken drugs.
Rather than invoking an actually existent past and comparing it with the present, I think the point from which we can criticize the current moment, the point at which it can be found wanting, is in terms of the futures that were projected from the 20th century, not the actually existing past. That it's the shocking difference between what we thought might have happened and what actually has happened.
On one level, the 60s revolt was an impressive illustration of Lenin's remark that the capitalist will sell you the rope to hang him with. In the UK, Stuart Hall felt similar frustrations with much of the existing left frustrations that were all the more intense in his case because he thought of himself as a socialist. But the socialism that Hall wanted, a socialism that could engage with the yearnings and dreamings that he heard in Miles Davis' music, was yet to be created, and its arrival was obstructed as much by figures from the left as from the right. The first obstructive figure of the left was the complacent steward of Cold War organized labor or social democracy, backward-looking, bureaucratic, resigned to the inevitability of capitalism, more interested in preserving the income and status of white men than in expanding the struggle to include. This figure is defined by compromise and eventual failure. The other figure, what I want to call the harsh Leninist superego, is defined by its absolute refusal of compromise. According to Freud, the superego is characterized by the quantitatively and qualitatively excessive nature of its demands. Whatever we do, it's never enough. The harsh Leninist superego mandates a militant ascesis. The militant will be single-mindedly dedicated to the revolutionary event, and unflinchingly committed to the means necessary to bring it about. The harsh Leninist superego is as indifferent to suffering as it is hostile to pleasure. Lenin's phobic response to music is instructive here. I can't listen to music too often. It affects your nerves, makes you want to say stupid nice things and stroke the heads of people who could create such beauty while living in this vile hell. While the complacent leaders of organized labor were invested in the status quo, the harsh Leninist superego stakes everything on a world absolutely different to this one. It was this post-revolutionary world which would redeem the Leninist, and it was from the perspective of this world that they judged themselves.
In the meantime, it is legitimate and indeed necessary to cultivate an indifference towards current suffering. We can and must step over homeless people, because giving to charity only obstructs the coming of the revolution. But this revolution had little in common with the social and psychic revolution of almost inconceivable magnitude that Ellen Willis thought was seated in the counterculture's dreamings. The revolution, as she conceived of it, would at once be more immediate and would fundamentally concern how care and domestic arrangements were organized, and more far-reaching. The transformed world would be unimaginably stranger than anything Marxist-Leninism had projected.
A counter-exorcism of the specter of a world which could be free. Acid Communism is the name I have given to this specter. The concept of acid communism is a provocation and a promise. It is a joke of sorts, but one with very serious purpose. It points to something that, at one point, seemed inevitable, but which now appears impossible: the convergence of class consciousness, socialist feminist consciousness raising, and psychedelic consciousness, the fusion of new social movements with a communist project, an unprecedented aestheticization of everyday life.
If you have been enjoying our content, please consider registering your desire with the algorithm by liking and subscribing. This really does help us grow and reach a wider community. If you would like to support our work of documenting and nurturing the rise of post-capitalist desires, become a patron. This allows us to continue research-based memes, podcasts, and videos, as well as up our production value. Patrons receive early views of videos, exclusive content, and more, including physical art and the ability to directly influence our research topics. The building of a better world happens on many fronts. Turn on, tune in, and shape a future collective reality.